as the organizer of the session, I just want to give you a bit of background why we're looking specifically at misinformation targeting minority communities. And at the propaganda vertical of CME, the way we got to studying this in the US was actually slightly convoluted in the sense that we were looking at different countries around the world, and we were looking at emerging technologies and how they're used to manipulate public opinion. And we found that messaging apps, so something that is actually originally connected or like we associate with private texting, right? Like sending a WhatsApp message or using Signal for more secure communication in Egypt or whatever, has developed into a tool that is actively used by propagandists to spread mis and disinformation. However, for large parts of the US population, they don't even use WhatsApp, for instance, but specific parts of the US population, for them, WhatsApp is crucial. Indian Americans, for instance, and they use it within the community in the US as a main organizing tool and communication platform, and also obviously with people from India. So this is kind of how we got to this, and the work that Kayo will talk about much more really focused on diaspora communities. We have three main pillars. We have qualitative work that's interview-based, but we also we fielded a survey looking at Indian Americans, Mexican Americans, and Cuban Americans, how they use WhatsApp, how important or not important WhatsApp is for news consumption, political engagement, etc. And then the third pillar is a WhatsApp monitor, a dashboard that we're building with collaborators at Rutgers University, which is displaying basically viral WhatsApp messages. And it's been used a lot by journalists in Brazil and India before previous elections, and can be used, for instance, as a jumping off point for fact-checking in those like more private and closed spaces where we often have much less of an idea of what's actually going on. So it's just kind of the background of the topic. I think the three speakers we picked will be really great because we want to make the session useful for you all. One prerequisite I just want to point out is just how crucial we think that how intertwined and entangled offline effects of online misinformation are with like structural parameters of majority versus minority populations, also in the US. And this is like really important for our democracy, and this is even more important with regard to midterm elections. So I partially agree with Talia that I'm a bit scared, and then I also partially agree with the previous speaker that I'm quite positive because we've seen a lot of community pushback already. And I think with that, I'll hand it over to Summer. And we actually said 10 minutes per presentation, maybe one or two quick follow-ups, but like the second half, 30 minutes of the session should be entirely for discussion.
Okay, hoping this will work. Hi, everyone, and I'm so glad to be here, and thank you, Inga, and everyone for the introduction. So as said, my name is Summer Lopez. I'm the Chief Program Officer of Free Expression at PEN America, and for folks who may not be as familiar with PEN America, I just want to introduce this briefly. We're an organization that works at the intersection of literature and human rights to defend freedom of expression, to support and defend writers under threat, and to celebrate the power of the written word. And we are a membership organization, members around the country. We have 10 chapters around the country, including here in Austin. And so it's especially nice to be here. But we started working on disinformation in 2017. With the release of the first report that we have done on the issue. We've done a number of them now called Faking News, in which we really talked about why we see disinformation as a threat to freedom of expression, to sort of our ability to have fact-based civic democratic discourse, why it's a threat to freedom of the press, and to our democracy as a whole. And since then, and you can see here also that the PEN Charter, which was written back in 1948, makes reference to the dangers of mendacious publication, which is, if you get a bunch of writers and poets together, how they would describe disinformation, but quite prescient, I think, as well. And since 2017, we've been running media literacy programs. We've developed a major campaign to counter disinformation around the 2020 election. And we conducted over the past year a survey of journalists around the country about the impact disinformation is having on them and their work. So I want to talk about that a little bit today, too. But some of our media literacy work in recent years has focused particularly on COVID and vaccine-related misinformation targeting communities of color. And we have worked in partnership with 4 national organizations serving Native American, Latinx, Black, and AAPI communities to conduct listening sessions and offer tailored resources and trainings for community leaders. And the next sort of stage of this work is focused on the elections and engaging with those sort of trusted figures in communities, faith leaders, local journalists, librarians, educators, and others, specifically in Texas, Arizona, and Florida, to ensure that they have the tools and resources to talk about disinformation and hopefully build resilience to it in their communities. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we've learned from this work. I'm sure Jacobo is going to go deeper on some of these things too, and then say a little bit about those survey results too. So 2 sort of obvious things that I nonetheless feel important to mention at the start of this particular conversation. One is that communities of color are disproportionately targeted by disinformation. And those campaigns are often part of broader efforts to disenfranchise, to stifle political participation, and particularly voting in those communities. But sometimes they're also just an effort to further erode trust and stoke division, right? Sometimes there's a particular narrative that purveyors of disinformation are trying to get across, but sometimes it's really just about fostering a general sense of uncertainty, disempowerment, and the feeling that you can't really believe anything. And 2, disinformation campaigns often exploit the fact that communities of color have well-grounded reasons to be distrusting of institutions that have historically failed or harmed them, whether that's government or the medical community or the media. In talking to Black community leaders about vaccine messaging, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis was mentioned repeatedly as a ongoing source of skepticism about messaging around healthcare coming from officials. In Native American communities, obviously, deep distrust of any government messenger for obvious reasons. And we also heard about the legacies of trauma and distrust that immigrant communities may be carrying with them that may not be as obvious to U.S. institutions. So people talked about older members of Chinese immigrant communities who may have lived through the Cultural Revolution and the impact that has on them. And we see how Venezuelan and Cuban diaspora communities are often targeted with narratives that fearmonger around socialism based on the experience they may have had in dictatorial regimes in their home countries. And then in our programs and our survey, we have heard repeatedly about the dearth of really simple, credible sources of news information in languages other than English. So even in Spanish, but certainly when you look at languages beyond that. And people gave examples such as Chinese immigrant communities who essentially feel like they have to choose between Chinese Communist Party propaganda outlets and the Epoch Times, which is also a known purveyor of disinformation. And we saw that where distrust in mainstream media is high, people are often turning to community and ethnic media outlets, which are, of course, critical sources of information for those communities, but are also, of course, the outlets that are often the most under-resourced and understaffed. And we also heard exactly what Inga was saying about the role of things like WhatsApp and WeChat and how much disinformation is circulating there that doesn't really get kind of seen or fact-checked or identified or talked about. So ensuring these credible sources of information are available, accessible, and trusted is essential, but, and I'm sure this will not come as a surprise to any of you, it's why you're here, journalists and newsrooms are also feeling the impact of disinformation. So, as I mentioned, we did a survey over the past year of over 1,000 journalists and editors from around the country to better understand how they and their newsrooms are wrestling with disinformation. And I'll share some highlights, but I would say the sort of TLDR is, I think we're in kind of a perfect storm here in which disinformation is creating immense new burdens for journalists, personal and professional, at the same time as the work of journalism is becoming even more essential as a bulwark against that disinformation itself and the erosion of our democracy. At the same time as other threats like online and offline harassment and intimidation are increasing, and of course all of that against the landscape of sort of struggles of the business model of journalism and the crisis particularly in local journalism. So there was consensus, of course, among the surveyed journalists that disinformation is a serious problem for journalism and that it's impacting their work. And we really received a flood of responses in the sort of narrative space in this. It was clear that we touched a nerve. Lots of them were very passionate about what they were dealing with. So More than 90% of the respondents said that they had made changes in their journalistic practice as a result of disinformation. And that involved, of course, spending more time fact-checking, a number of different things that take additional time and effort. 17% also said that they had opted at some point not to do a story out of fear of having it labeled fake news and having their work discredited as a result of that. At the same time, most journalists said they didn't feel that they had the sort of specialized skills or the newsroom support systems to respond to disinformation adequately. And there was also real uncertainty regarding some of the fundamental questions of how to respond. So this question that just came up about, what do you debunk and what do you choose not to elevate at all? We asked that question and people had very mixed responses in terms of what they thought the right response was, and many of them just said they really didn't know how to approach that. And to bring it back to the elections, the group journalists most identified as being targeted by disinformation was voters, with high levels also for communities of color, racial, or ethnic minority groups, and senior citizens, of course, communities that also face more hurdles to voting. And they also identified the greatest sources of disinformation as right-wing conspiracy theorists, and next was elected officials, candidates, and political organizations, which obviously raises difficult questions about how journalists cover disinformation coming from candidates for office in the context of an election. And overall, there were not a lot of differences in the survey responses when disaggregated by race, but the results did show that journalists of color were quite significantly more likely to be aware of disinformation campaigns targeting racial or ethnic minority groups or non-English speakers and targeting poor communities. So another reason why newsroom diversity matters as well. So obviously, this is a huge challenge. What can journalists do? I'm going to throw out just a few sort of guiding principles that we talk about, but I also really look forward to the Q&A as a conversation too. I'd love to hear some of what you all are doing and thinking about. The first is community engagement, and I know a lot of newsrooms are doing really amazing work in this. Of course, it's another thing that takes time and effort. But I think being out in communities, especially those that are most likely to be targeted by disinformation, is essential, and having the opportunity to talk about the work that you do, how you do it, why you do it, and to find and connect with the community leaders who serve as those kind of trusted sources of information and who have visibility on what narratives may be emerging within their communities. Also getting ahead of these disinformation narratives. Pre-bunking, when you report the facts before the disinformation gets to take hold, is a lot less complicated than the questions around debunking. And repeating those facts over and over is effective. People believe something a little more every time they hear it. It's a tactic that the purveyors of disinformation utilize, and so we should use that to bolster belief in facts as well. Meeting people where they're at. We talked about this a lot in the context of the 2020 elections. Talking about the process of the elections was so important that year, especially because it was very unusual that year. But doing that early in advance so people had that kind of knowledge going into the election, ideally makes them less likely to be misled by people who try to tell them that the process has gone wrong later on. And then we always tell ourselves and others to address disinformation with empathy and without judgment, right? Disinformation is designed to exploit our psychology and the way that our brains work. It's not about education levels or sophistication necessarily. It's really, all of us are vulnerable to it. And even the word disinformation itself, I think, has become quite fraught and can put people on the defensive. So we try to talk more about ensuring access to credible information and empowering people to make informed decisions. This also can't be on individual journalists alone. This has to be something that newsrooms are thinking about, what their strategies are for dealing with disinformation, and particularly in communities of color that they may serve. So this is something that we are also really committed to working on. We have some resources that I would happy to say more about, but we're also in a stage of trying to figure out what else is needed and where else we can be helpful. So I'd really love to hear from everybody in the room today and also stay in touch. So thank you.
Are there any immediate follow-up questions for Summer? And Kayo?
Okay, hi. Again, my name is Kayo. I'm a graduate research fellow at Center for Media Engagement. In this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about our ongoing research project here at the CME, which focuses on how misinformation spreads through encrypted messaging apps like WhatsApp in diaspora communities specifically. And today I'm going to specifically focus on what we've learned so far from the interviews that we did from the Latino communities in Florida and Texas, but I'm hoping that some of the insights that we got from those communities are going to be helpful for folks who are working with other diaspora communities as well. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of the project overview, at the Center for Media Engagement, we're now looking at how groups of color, including immigrant groups and diaspora communities, are being targeted with disinformation on encrypted messaging apps and how they are responding to those content so that we can suggest what various stakeholders can do about the problem and how we can help the communities combat disinformation and misinformation. And we are currently conducting qualitative, in-depth interviews with 4 diaspora and immigrant communities across the United States. And we're also developing a web-based monitoring system for WhatsApp called WhatsApp Monitor, which I'm not going to focus specifically today. But if you're interested and curious, I'm sure we can give you more information about that. And those are 4 states and 6 communities that we are focusing on. We've just started reaching out to people who identify with Korean American communities in Atlanta, Georgia. We've spoken with folks in Cuban and Venezuelan American communities in Miami, and Chinese and Indian American communities in Houston, and Mexican American communities in San Antonio here in Texas. And so far, we've seen that in those Latino communities, WhatsApp is by far the most popular messaging app they use to communicate with friends and family members, both here in the United States, also in their home countries. According to Pew Research Center data, 46% of people in Latino communities use WhatsApp, compared with 23% for Black users and 16% for white users. So it kind of shows how popular this WhatsApp group is, and it's also popular among Indian communities, while WeChat is often used by the Chinese American communities here. Our research team also recently conducted a cross-sectional survey of about 1,500 participants in those 3 diasporic communities of Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, and Indian Americans. And the results also show that WhatsApp is perceived as one of the leading platforms for false information about politics. And it's ranking second following social media platforms, but leading before online news websites and other traditional media sources like TV and radio. But some of our Cuban interviewees said that, for example, Telegram and Signal are becoming more and more popular for political conversations for specifically conservative members of the Cuban American communities, particularly after deplatforming of Donald Trump, and also because of the fact that WhatsApp is owned by Meta. So we have to keep in mind that the way people use those apps can differ from community to community, and it can also change over time. So on those apps, and especially for the Latino communities, misinformation is not sort of like a phenomenon that they see only during salient media events like elections, but it has become a part of everyday communication because misinformation has sort of creeped into those smaller private chat groups on EMAs as part of their daily conversations. A lot of people we interviewed so far told us that their family members, friends, and sometimes church groups are often the main sources of misinformation. We didn't ask them how they define, we didn't give them the definition, but when we asked, so like, do you see misinformation? Oh, and then they would say, oh yeah, we get it from friends, families, aunt, grandmothers, grandfathers, oftentimes. And actually, few of them said that they would encounter misinformation from unknown, users or groups or scams, those kind of, dubious accounts that they don't know, but they often content often gets forwarded by the people that they know very well. And the fact that misinformation being shared often by their friends and family make it hard for people to refute those content or call out on those content, because they often want to just avoid, like arguing with people, or, they just don't want any animosity. They just want to keep it quiet and, friendly space. Or they can't even just simply leave the chat groups so that they don't have to see those content, because that would also mean shutting down the communication channels with those the loved ones. So that makes it harder for them to combat misinformation on those chat spaces. Also, many of our interviewees shared their experiences where misinformation changed people's opinions by sort of leveraging trusted relationships. The quote on the right side, if you can see, is by one of the interviewees we spoke from. He's from San Antonio. He said his friend turned some of the people into anti-vaxxers. He actually had like 16 or like 15 people who were like old friends of his, and then this friend constantly bombarded the chat group with anti-vaxxer content, and eventually about 10 people were turned into anti-vaxxers, and they decided to not get vaccinated, and he was very emotional about it. And then a lot of other people that we spoke with sort of shared similar experiences. And interestingly, a lot of people saw chat apps as the least trustworthy sources for news. It's not their go-to when they search for news or when they want to get updates about what's happening. But they end up seeing news the most on those chat apps, because their close friends and family members constantly send them a lot of content, and they end up spending a lot of time on WhatsApp and other chat apps. So there's sort of like an involuntary consumption of news or political content on those chat apps. But I'd like to emphasize that people were very aware of, for example, how attention economy works, and how doing on their fact-checking could drag them easily into the rabbit hole of internet where they can't get out. So they seem to already have adapted to this environment where it's inundated with misinformation, and they often actively disengage with dubious content sent from their friends and family. So it's kind of like their strategy to navigate through those spaces. So they said they don't even click or react to those content, instead of just checking what's happening in the link, or like just sending it to friends to try to fact check it together and stuff. But it is still detrimental, because it does increase general distrust in news and sow discord in tight-knit communities of close friends and families. So observations by our interviewees also point to the nuances and sort of complexity in Latino media landscapes. Misinformation in these communities often spread, like Summer also mentioned, often spreads in the voice in the Spanish language media ecosystem. And I'm sure Jacob can talk more about these issues, but as you can see, those pictures, which were shared by one of the people that we spoke with, are all in Spanish, and they often get translated from English to Spanish before they end up being shared on WhatsApp. But a lack of diversity in the Spanish language media makes it harder for people to address those content. And for example, for Cuban communities, people have told us that local Spanish radio stations, which have been, major megaphone for the Cuban exile communities, still remain a trusted source of news for many people. So Spanish language content, including sometimes misinformation and hyper-partisan content from those traditional media sources, especially radio stations there, ends up being spread on WhatsApp as a form of clips or memes. So WhatsApp or these chat apps are the places where all kinds of content ends up being shared to a variety of, people from, generations of their grandmother, younger generations, and all members of the communities. Sorry, I forgot to click those. So from those insights, what can we do and what should we keep in mind in supporting those communities? We've learned from those people that we spoke with that in order to effectively address the problem of misinformation targeting different communities, we need to pay much closer attention to community-specific topics and differences in how people use those chat apps. In some communities, it's WhatsApp, but in Cuban communities, for example, other chat apps are becoming more popular, for example. And we should also factor into the language dynamics to support those communities. And we should also consider the nuances of Hispanic media landscapes in the current hybrid media ecosystem. And all of these remind us that we can't treat the Latino communities as sort of like a homogeneous minority group, but rather they are very diverse and complex. And finally, if these environments offer an alternative to what is considered as the majority-dominated public discourse or public spaces, how can we help address misinformation while protecting those spaces as, you know, like a space for political discourses for minority groups? And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Hey everyone, I'm Jacobo. I'm the disinformation research lead with Equis Labs. Equis Labs is a research and experimentation hub that's kind of trying to identify new ways or the best ways to engage the Latino community. So a lot of what I will be focusing on today is around like kind of disinformation in Latino communities and kind of touching on a lot of what Summer and Kayo have already spoken about. So kind of just to start, I kind of want to just kind of talk a little bit about the problem when it comes to disinformation among Latino communities, specifically also in Spanish language spaces online. So I think one thing to notice here on just the top left post is a story from NBC News, just kind of talking about how Latinos consume and engage or share disinformation more than often other groups. I will note that it's oftentimes hard to measure kind of how often disinformation is spreading, but they kind of use this based off Nielsen ratings and Nielsen reports on how kind of disinformation is spreading in Latino communities. But some other things just that's very similar to maybe the broader disinformation ecosystem that we see in Spanish language spaces, but also in kind of Latino spaces where they're spreading stuff in English as well is very similar narratives around, like, for example, during the COVID pandemic, anti-vaccine narratives, anti-restriction narratives and things like that. But then also obviously around elections, we saw a lot over the last few years, much more in 2020, and we kind of continue to see it. It hasn't necessarily stopped after the 2020 election. A lot of the similar narratives that we saw in 2020 continue to spread afterwards and are kind of continuing to spread, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there's also kind of more conspiracy theory type stuff like QAnon that's also spreading oftentimes in Spanish in different spaces, including WhatsApp or closed spaces, but also in kind of the mainstream platforms as well. And then obviously just kind of the impact of disinformation. We've all kind of been talking about this, but this isn't necessarily just in Spanish language spaces, but we've seen it kind of cause distrust, not just towards institutions in the government, but as many of you all may be aware of, as well as a distrust towards media in different institutions. But also we see different instances, for example, like January 6th, which oftentimes was fueled by disinformation that kind of was spreading around those topics. One thing specifically kind of related to Latinx communities is kind of, especially with WhatsApp and kind of what we heard earlier around communication within like kind of small groups or small settings, is that oftentimes when you do interact with this, it causes conflict. So we've heard definitely stories of, family or friends kind of, getting into arguments or conflicts with other members that they are close with, that kind of has led to like kind of longer term negative impacts in relationships due to the conversations around disinformation and what to believe and what not to believe. But I guess kind of focusing more on like kind of some key dynamics when it comes to disinformation in Latino communities, I think there's two important things. And one is that Latinos in the United States are targeted with disinformation from domestic actors, similar to the way it's spreading in English, but also foreign actors. And I don't necessarily mean foreign actors as in like Russia or foreign interference, which is also happening in Spanish, but similarly also just content from Latin America is shaping the views of Latinos in the United States. Not just necessarily disinformation, but also just information. A lot of Latinos consume news from Latin America, or they use WhatsApp chats where they're communicating with family abroad, who are then spreading content back and forth. So I would just say Spanish language disinformation is very cyclical, where a lot of information that may start in English in the US reaches Spanish speakers in Latin America, and then almost kind of comes back to the US in Spanish, or vice versa, where Spanish content is starting in Latin America and then reaching the US. And then also just the Spanish language information voids. There's not as many places for Latinos who are Spanish dominant to consume news and information, and so they often go to social media platforms like WhatsApp, like YouTube, to get information. And these voids are often filled with problematic content, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and things like that. So WhatsApp is definitely one thing that we've heard a lot about. I would just say that YouTube is another space where specifically Latino communities are consuming a lot of information on and getting a lot of news and spending more than just a bit of time to just kind of get entertainment on YouTube, but also consuming news and information from YouTube. Here's just a chart that kind of shows social media consumption among 3 different communities based off Pew Research data, white, black, and Hispanic communities. And as you can see, Latinos is over-indexed on multiple platforms. YouTube, they're consuming more information. It's pretty close to other communities as well, but higher levels. Same with WhatsApp. Obviously, WhatsApp's not as high as maybe YouTube or Facebook, but it's much higher. As we heard earlier, 50% or nearly 50% of Latinos are consuming, or no, sorry, not consuming, but using WhatsApp as a platform to, get information, but also communicate. TikTok is just another one that I think is something to mention, just given that, a few years ago didn't exist. It was at 0%. And so it's now at, 30%, nearly 30% of Latinos are using information on TikTok. And I expect that to, grow drastically over the next few years, especially among younger demographic groups. And TikTok is just a space where a lot of information is spreading, but also a lot of disinformation, and you can fall very easily into these kind of rabbit holes where you may kind of start seeing anti-vaccine information and kind of start liking that content, and then you're just kind of trapped in these spaces where all you're seeing is anti-vaccine content. So TikTok is just one platform that isn't as popular as maybe YouTube or Facebook, but is kind of emerging and growing pretty rapidly. And then kind of just talking about more specifically about the Latino community again is kind of just the information voids that exist in Latino communities. Obviously, there are some traditional news outlets like Telemundo, Univision that have been for years now, decades, been a place for Latinos to consume information, but there's also less traditional media sources for Spanish speakers. There's more and more coming, but they're not as in the same kind of maybe presence or impact as maybe English language news outlets. So oftentimes Latinos are then having to go to social media to not just communicate with their friends, but also consume news and information. And that's where kind of maybe oftentimes the disinformation is spreading and conspiracy theories are spreading, and they're consuming a lot of this information maybe more often than others, as we saw from the previous chart where they over-index on a lot of social media platforms. And then also another big factor when it comes to Spanish language misinformation is just the role of social media platforms. Obviously, social media platforms haven't necessarily done a great job at moderating content in any language, including in English, but in Spanish, they do a much poorer job, and really on any other language, a much poorer job at moderating content compared to English. So, for example, in the 2020 election, there was things that like Facebook or YouTube or Twitter would label as misleading or false information around the outcome of the election. In Spanish, they would not necessarily always label that content. There's still stuff from November 2020 up today that has no label or no kind of fact check around it. And these are just some examples in Spanish. And then one other thing that I kind of mentioned earlier is that these kind of election fraud narratives continued beyond the election. It definitely also continued in English, but just noting that in Spanish, even this year, prior to kind of midterm conversations appearing online, there was still a lot of conversation around the 2020 election and voter fraud and kind of disinformation narratives around that. And I know this is oftentimes focused on, or this is focused a lot on election disinformation, but just want to note that this also happened around COVID disinformation. Here's a post, for example, on Facebook where the English post, it's the exact same video. The English post got labeled pretty quickly by Facebook, saying it was, a conspiracy theory, false information. The Spanish post never really got labeled. I believe it might be labeled now, but it was like a year after the post was up when no one's really, looking at that content anymore anyways, where it's maybe not as helpful. And then here's just another example where it's not necessarily the same post, but examples of like kind of the same concept where they claimed athletes were, collapsing on the field because of the vaccine, which wasn't necessarily true, but English posts would get labeled, Spanish posts weren't necessarily always getting labeled. And then also just one quick thing that I want to note is at Equis, we did a disinformation poll recently, kind of just trying to understand kind of how much of an impact this disinformation really is on Latino communities. So I just want to note a couple of things here that we noticed around kind of disinformation narratives, whether it was kind of these right-wing disinfo narratives, even left-wing disinfo narratives, nonpartisan narratives, and kind of around different topics, what we found was that Latinos were very familiar with disinformation, but it wasn't necessarily that they believed disinformation or that they were believing it more than other groups. I know we talk about like disinformation might be targeted more at communities of color, which I believe it to be the case as well, but just something to note is that what we saw from our poll is that there was more of a great deal of uncertainty about whether to believe it, whether it was true or false. They weren't necessarily falling for it more than others, but they just weren't sure what to believe in. They were skeptical, just like many other groups, about because just so much information is coming towards them on what is true or what is false. And then something to note here is that the most widespread narratives, so COVID, anti-vaccine narratives, election narratives that are more widespread, they were often likely to say that they weren't true. So I think that's a good thing for media and journalists to note that fact checks appear to be working, or at least communicating about a lot of these narratives that are more widespread and kind of trying to explain the truth appears to maybe potentially help on obviously making people make sure not to believe in these disinfo narratives. And then a couple other things related to what I just said is kind of just the susceptibility of disinformation. I think oftentimes we hear, especially around Spanish communities, that Latinos maybe are more susceptible to disinformation than other groups, and I just would note that it's to be careful about when writing about stuff like that, because again, we saw that they weren't necessarily falling for it. It was just more that they were uncertain about what to believe and what not to believe. And in fact, we actually noticed that a lot of people who were more politically engaged, which we determined by, register to vote, voting in elections, and also based off consuming political news and information, that they were actually the ones that were more believing disinformation narratives, and not necessarily people who maybe aren't consuming that much information. So just something to note here at the end is that a lot of Latinos are maybe unsure what to believe, but they're not necessarily being fooled by disinformation, and maybe, or at least not being fooled more than other groups. And then a couple recommendations here just around fact-checking and filling information voids. I think one thing that's important is we saw earlier about kind of media consumption and the use of WhatsApp and YouTube. YouTube is one, for example, where we have done studies where Latinos are spending twice as much time on YouTube as non-Latino adults. And I have seen through just my disinformation monitoring that a lot of Spanish content isn't necessarily these like 2-minute videos or 5-minute videos. It's actually like an hour-long video where they post every single day and are getting hundreds of thousands of views on a daily basis, and essentially explaining the news, and users are using those influencers or accounts to get their news and information. So just filling information voids, like being able to be in spaces, whether it's YouTube, whether it's WhatsApp, and just kind of reaching Latinos where they are consuming their news and information, and trying to get into these spaces, even with fact checks. If there's ways to disseminate fact checks beyond just maybe the traditional news site or your or social media, or maybe like the Twitter page, but also beyond that. I didn't note this earlier, but just one thing that I should have noted before on the Twitter, on the WhatsApp, on the media consumption chart, Twitter was much lower than, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. It was even lower than TikTok. And I know that a lot of journalists and media and even a lot of organizations use Twitter, which I'm not saying not to use Twitter, but it's just something to note that a lot of users are not necessarily on Twitter, but are rather on a lot of other platforms where it would be important to kind of disseminate a lot of that content as well on. Yep, that's all I got.
You say that communities of color are not more susceptible per se, but because of the sheer volume of more information in those communities, does that mean that there are a greater amount of people that are falling for it just because there's a greater quantity of misinformation?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think part of it is that it's really hard to measure like how much disinformation is spreading in any community, right? Like, for example, we talked about WhatsApp, like how much of a certain video is actually going on WhatsApp when we don't even know what's on there. And so I think that's just one important thing to know, that I've definitely seen in Spanish language spaces a lot of disinformation spreading, and we talked about kind of the role of social media platforms where they're not moderating the content, so that may be also another reason why it can be more problematic, where the content's not getting labeled, the fact checks aren't reaching them. So I mainly just note that because oftentimes I see more and more now when there's kind of more coverage around Spanish language misinformation and people have kind of recognized the problem with it, it oftentimes gets featured as, I don't want to say like necessarily this way, but like Latinos are dumber than other groups, when that's not necessarily the case. It's more that, like you said, disinformation is targeted so often, and there's not many other spaces to go to get accurate and good information. And so as a result, they see a lot of disinformation and not necessarily more accurate information, and so they become skeptical or not really sure what to believe in. And just so from our poll, we just saw that it wasn't necessarily that they believed the narratives, but they just weren't sure what to believe in. So that's an opportunity for journalists and others to spread accurate, good information so that they can have another avenue to kind of consume this more accurate information.
Do you have something to add? Maybe to be concrete, like, can you give some examples? You were saying, for instance, after 2020, actually the narratives or the themes haven't changed so much. So maybe one or two examples of that. And then Kayo, with regard to WhatsApp, which is like obviously really hard to monitor, but since you've been speaking to so many community members, maybe some examples of like when they gave examples of misinformation they saw on WhatsApp. Was there the video, largely images like we shared, or like links to other news organizations? Like I remember when we interviewed people in Arabic-speaking countries, it was largely links that were shared to newspaper articles, which were then like fake outlets that only existed for 2 weeks or something like that.
Yeah, I can start, yeah. So I think some examples related to, like, I guess, election disinformation is, so a lot of the narratives we saw around 2020, like leading up to the election around kind of the vote by mail process and kind of distrust towards that process, but then also after the election ended, kind of just claims that either Democrats stole the election or that different person won the election. A lot of that content continued after November 2020 and kind of continued happening in 2021. But we also noticed, so for example, the California recall in 2021, there was narratives in Spanish spreading that like, oh, they stole this election too, or there was fraud in this election. Or they recycled old stories. So there were stories about, postal workers like finding a bucket of ballots that never reached people, for example. And some of those stories are actually, so there might be like one story that actually is true, that there was this bucket of ballots, but then they use that to kind of say like, this is happening everywhere, right? So a lot of this stuff was spreading and kind of getting recycled throughout 2021 when elections were coming up. Saw it in Virginia elections and New Jersey elections in 2021, and then kind of continued to spread even this year. So I believe that the narratives in 2022, whether leading up to the election now or after, are kind of very similar to the ones we saw in 2020 and recycled stories, or at least using the same type of narratives.
Yeah, so our research project is obviously interview-based and qualitative, so we've spoken to 20 folks for each community, so we're still interviewing heavily. So I don't mean to generalize from just, what we've learned from those folks, but one interesting thing is when we ask, so what are the examples of misinformation or dubious information that you've seen? A lot of folks will be like, I don't remember, let me think. And it's kind of, it takes time for them to remember, obviously because they get so much information, particularly Mexican American communities. They use WhatsApp very heavily for just saying hi, good morning, and like their grandma would send memes with the prayers, and so it's like so much information that people wake up to 150 notifications for WhatsApp. So it's really hard it's kind of become sort of ambient for them. But when we keep asking them, so, do you remember specifically during the election or like COVID? And then they would be like, oh yeah, I've seen like memes or like videos, but they wouldn't remember the specific content. So I think you're right that it's not that they like fall for it and believe in it, but they're like generally skeptical about the misinformation. They're kind of trying to distance from those contents. So that is a problem because they just generally there's a lot of distrust in news, so that's also an opportunity to give them factual information. But in terms of examples from the Mexican American community, we've heard a lot of COVID-related information, especially in the forms of memes, but also TikTok, YouTube videos, and then one person said, yeah, we get all kinds of content, clips from TV, links from news sources. So it's basically like a hodgepodge of content, I would say. For Cuban communities, most of them mention that it's socialism, fear of socialism. But sometimes it's hard to get like a very specific examples unless they just have those memes or videos saved in their phone and they can send them to us. So because they don't remember, and I think that's very telling of how much information they're getting from those apps.
Oh, now I have a thought. Maybe I saw you first, and then.
So I had a question about how media organizations can tap into these spaces or sort of bring, because obviously like we're seeing inundation of disinformation, but how can a media organization that has, say, a Spanish news section, say, get our stuff onto WhatsApp or get our, are there any projects underway? Are there any ideas that you guys have? Because we've talked about this problem in our newsroom all the time and we don't know what to do.
And can I just piggyback before, and how do they trust that local organization if there is a way to be more
Right,
present in those spaces when there is such a low trust to begin with?
Yeah, I definitely have some thoughts, but if you guys want to start.
I mean, I guess just to that point, I would say, and I hope you can hear me because I don't have a microphone, but I think as I said, I think part of our focus has been on figuring out kind of who are the trusted figures in those communities and then working with them because, it's the same for us coming in as an organization. We're not going to sort of bring our media literacy programming in and who are we? But in working through community organizations that are serving that community or working with the people who people are going to turn to, again, whether that's the faith leader, community activists, might be local officials in some cases. We just had a bunch of conversations in the Dallas area, and there was a mayor in one of the towns outside Dallas who got mentioned several times as somebody that people really trusted. So I think working through those folks and kind of figuring out who they are is one tactic.
Yeah, I mean, we recently did a study to kind of just see who are trusted messengers. And we did kind of and it was the same person on all videos, but they didn't see every video. So someone presented themselves as a journalist, someone presented themselves as someone from a local organization or just kind of a local member of the community. And all three of them actually reduced uncertainty, but the journalists actually improved it the most. We're still kind of working on these results, so eventually we'll have them out probably in the next few weeks. But it kind of just shows that journalists are still, even though oftentimes we see them as, or at least online, you see that there's more distrust towards them. We did see that it did help reduce uncertainty. There was a little sub-factor where we kind of just try to see from partisan divides, right-wing or people who were conservative showed more distrust towards journalists, but they still, even them, kind of reduced their uncertainty among disinfo narratives or false narratives when a journalist was speaking to them. I think just also more broadly in terms of trying to get into WhatsApp groups or also just being able to communicate with trusted sources. We have seen oftentimes this may be more independent journalists who do this, who kind of start these WhatsApp groups with local community members, but it might just be tapping into trusted, for example, if there's a trusted kind of Latino organization in the community, tapping into the leaders of that organization so that you can kind of be featured more often among the community and build that trust. Because I think that's one thing that we definitely see is being able to build that trust, because even disinfo or bad actors on YouTube, what they do is a long process where some YouTubers now have hundreds of thousand plus subscribers, but they definitely started on a low kind of scale, and they continue to build that trust and continue to kind of say the same messages. And so, I mean, obviously not saying to copy what they do, but I think there's actually a lot of things that you can learn, actually, even from bad actors who are spreading this information, at least the tactics that they use to then kind of communicate with people. I'm not necessarily saying to copy the bad things that they do, but kind of building out the trust that they even do when they communicate with their followers.
I think just to add to that, from the actual person who we interviewed today was saying that they wish that they could get some sort of notification or factual information or flags without leaving the platform of WhatsApp, because they know that there's a lot of information out there if they go to a website, but they just stay on WhatsApp for so long that they were saying, oh, on Instagram at least we get this notification when we see some content about COVID. They would show that this is a piece of content about COVID, so they have this mark to warn them that maybe you want to be careful, but they were saying on WhatsApp we get nothing, so that's really kind of inconvenient for them. So maybe more presence on WhatsApp where they are, just meeting, where they are, might be helpful for the community.
I think just one other kind of quick thing related to writing stories in English, something that I at least see from fact checks is that oftentimes when when I'm reading a fact check, it's always about English post, right? There's an English post and it's getting fact checked. Oftentimes what I see in Spanish, they're very similar narratives spreading in Spanish as in English, at least in the United States to Spanish speakers. And so even just replicating those stories in Spanish is useful. Or even adding just a line that, here are examples in English, well there's also examples in Spanish. Maybe it's harder to identify those Spanish posts, but at least kind of showing that this is also happening in Spanish and translating it in Spanish, I think is also just useful for Spanish speakers to be able to consume that information as well.
Just to continue the same theme, I'm based in Florida, based in South Florida. And obviously we've got a huge problem there with misinformation, disinformation. But I'm wondering if you all have seen any experience of a newsroom, be it small or large, tapping into some of these newer networks, social media networks like WhatsApp, and actually building an audience. Is there any example? The only one I can think of that I knew of was Documented. It's a New York-based digital newsroom that was trying to target the immigrant community, and it reached them through WhatsApp successfully. I'm wondering if you know of any media outlet that's been able to successfully tap into these newer social media outlets to actually gain an audience. And if so, how did they do it?
It's a great question. I also am familiar with Documented, but I also can't think of off the top of my head too many other examples.
So there are others around the world. So in Zimbabwe, for instance, is a really prominent example, and like other parts of Africa, who really kind of like build their news audience just via WhatsApp. In the US, because like I'm not a journalist, that's much. I'm not sure, but there are like more initiatives that are in that kind of like journalism fact-checking space. So Fact Checkeado is a big one who like works, I think, also a lot with journalists who try to like build similar systems that we have with the more open social media platforms for some time now, also for more closed ones, and that ideally would be like a like two-way thing, right? Where on the one hand you get like you have a tip line, etc. in place, but then also you build some trust with people who are in big group chats, so that then actually you can also spread some good information in there and stuff. And there was something else I would add, but no, I forgot.
I think that there are some that have worked on sort of text messaging systems, which can also be effective. So just doing those on WhatsApp, but they generally, I'm not sure how much they're actually using WhatsApp versus kind of having people subscribe for text message services business somehow.
And obviously, like, I mean, a lot of the things that we spoke about, even with like getting notifications and messages and Kayo, what you mentioned, like a lot of that is not up to obviously not us as researcher, but also not up to you all as journalists, but rather to the platforms, how they design themselves, right? So just for instance, if you ask the same question, not about WhatsApp, but about Telegram, actually quite a few examples in Miami, Florida, etc., that have been building and that recently, over the last months, got a lot of Russian misinformation and stuff because Telegram became the main, almost like misinformation platform with regard to the Ukraine war. So I think it kind of, that is then more a newsroom discussion, like kind of what kind of resources do we have, what we can afford, which platforms don't with, what are the features.
A question about, in election years, what do you find is the primary motivation for this misinformation? Is it to get these groups to vote one way or another, or to create mistrust in government so they don't participate, they don't vote, and kind of suppress the vote? I know up in Minneapolis and St. Paul we have a big Hmong community, a big Somali community, and oftentimes there's these stories that are created about, like you talked about, the buckets full of ballots being, carried through apartment complexes and whatnot. And it kind of creates this mistrust, and they go, well, why should we even go out and vote? Is there a primary motivation, or is it kind of all of the above?
I just add one quick insight, because we did quite a few interviews in Houston with Indian Americans and Chinese Americans over the summer. And what was really interesting there was that a lot of the misinformation, or at least like propaganda, they got over WhatsApp or WeChat, was really to get them to vote in like a certain direction, and it was all targeted towards local politics. But we already saw that like spin to like the state and national politics already, and it was largely building, or like really building on a fear of like insecurity. So Chinese Americans and Indian Americans, almost all of them were like quite susceptible, again not necessarily believing it, but susceptible for like, well, if we don't invest in the police, like there will be more crime, like a bunch of misinformation and wrong stories about exaggerated crime rates, etc. And then basically saying, okay, you need to vote for this candidate or this political party, if not, like the entire city and state and country is basically going to be lawless. And that was very prominent.
Yeah. I mean, I would say it's also just oftentimes all of the above. It depends also on like who is the one disseminating the content. Obviously, there's people who are trying to get people not to vote, but there's definitely actors who are trying to get people to vote a certain way. In Florida, for example, we see a lot of the, and again, this is kind of, a lot of times disinformation kind of maybe overlaps with other maybe like more problematic, harmful narratives that maybe aren't necessarily labeled as direct disinformation, but the kind of like anti-socialism narratives in Florida are definitely like heavily pushed there to kind of elicit fear among communities there to say like socialism is coming to the United States. So some of it might be more of like a partisan type thing to try to, you know, get people to vote a certain way, but I think it kind of depends on who's the one disseminating the content. There's also just people who are really just doing it for money. They have sites that I've seen somewhere a person came out that had 3 Spanish websites. They weren't even Spanish speakers, and they weren't even involved in like the political process or anything. They were just a gamer who was trying to make money on the side by disseminating like fake news. So it's kind of like all over the place, and so there's a lot of different, you know, factors on why they do it.
I think it depends a little bit too on who the target community is, right? I think Black voters tend to be very loyal Democratic voters, and so I think there's more voter repression targeting Black communities, whereas I think given there's sort of more conservative strands within some parts of Latino and Asian American communities, there may be more sort of attempt to coerce, you know, or change people's views on certain things, and just kind of make up of, you know, what role those voters play in kind of moving the election.
Are you seeing the level now heading into November at the same rate or greater than what we were seeing in 2020?
So it's currently quite hard to say, like what we've been like hearing a lot, especially with regard to those more private spaces, is that basically everyone we interviewed said, I'm so scared about what will come, because they've seen this with COVID and with some of the local elections, and even something like high school board elections got super political and WhatsApp, etc. And with regard to those more private spaces, they've all been saying, okay, I'm scared about what's to come because there's no way this is not going to be political. I've seen XYZ, XYZ. And what we heard a lot from the interviews as well is that kind of, well, Facebook, no one believes anymore what's on Facebook, but everyone still believes what they get like on WhatsApp or something from their friends. So this is a specific platform issue, but I think in general, also studying the broader space, like we're just
Yeah, they did say that they are expecting more things to come as we get closer to the elections, but we heavily interviewed, we did a lot of interviews over the summer, so they were like, oh yeah, we're still not getting that much. We definitely expect to talk about it more on WhatsApp and more content to come.
But topics that already came up were definitely like Roe v. Wade decision, and then like political messaging attached to that. Russia, Ukraine even sometimes came up. What were other more? Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like, I mean, the 2020 election also, there was so much of it, but I've definitely seen, I just from monitoring Spanish language even just the last few weeks to month, it's been picking up more, where these narratives are spreading more. I think also it's oftentimes like the political landscape. It seems like over the last month, the conversation around who's, like people guessing who's going to win the elections, it seems like it's now kind of getting into the middle. Before it was like, oh, Democrats are going to lose everything in November. Now it's like kind of nobody really knows, and I feel like there might be some relation there to like now seeing narratives around people trying to steal elections. But it's definitely picking up as it's getting closer to the election. We'll definitely expect it to be spreading everywhere before and after.
I'm a bit aware of time, but there was one hand up for a while.
I just trying to think how to frame this. When you're talking about the misinformation that's being received through WhatsApp, you talked about memes, about articles and videos. Is that being created specifically for this platform or for the purpose of misinformation? Or are you seeing where somebody or some group is taking actual news stories, maybe from credible media, and twisting the headline, twisting some of the facts, taking the photos or video out of context? What is the content?
I think it's both, that includes both, but they were all saying that they like literally get all kinds of content. So sometimes it's a piece of content taken from news sources that are credible, manipulated, or just cherry picked something out of context. But there are a lot of memes also circulating, but we don't know really like where they're coming from. But usually, I don't know if, because they get it often from friends and family. So I don't think grandmas are creating those content.
Right.
They often said they get it from other WhatsApp groups that they're apparently part of, which their children or family members are not part of. So they sometimes get to see what groups they are, but sometimes they take screenshot or they just save it in their phone and then they just send it to their family members or friends. So they were quite uncertain where they are coming from. So, but they could guess like, oh, yeah, there are a lot of content that are taken from news sources, but others are just junk from other whatever they see on the internet. So it's a lot of things.
I think it's also kind of popular to see like viral YouTube videos circulating on WhatsApp, especially like around COVID, whenever there was like these COVID disinformation videos that were spreading. Even if they were in English, they were spreading pretty widely at times. I mean, again, widely, I don't know because I didn't have access to tons of WhatsApp groups, but you would hear anecdotal evidence of a viral video spreading on WhatsApp among multiple like kind of family group chats. But as you all kind of noted, and we've seen in our poll, a poll that we did where like 90% of people who are consuming news and information on WhatsApp, it's coming from small individual group chats, not these like massive group chats that are like intentionally maybe trying to, they do exist, but I think that's like the problem. We don't know how wide it's spreading, and it's coming from trusted sources at times who may not be doing it intentionally, but are kind of falling for these narratives.